This is the final class of reasoning skills. Now we are talking about ethical reasoning as a way of wrapping up our discussion of critical thinking. In this session, we have some business and announcements to deal with first, and then we will get into some of the nuts and bolts of ethical reasoning. First, let me again wish you well. I hope you and the people around you are taking great care to wash your hands and not touch your faces and to avoid going out if at all possible. The grade records on Blackboard will be complete and visible to you shortly. We are just finalizing that. I know many of you are anxious about your grades. This is the last lecture, and I will introduce to you the last assignment. For this section on ethical reasoning, the larger topic, and the topic that's focused on in the textbook, is making ethical decisions. That is, you deciding what you're going to do, me deciding what I'm going to do, keeping ethics in mind. But we use arguments in order to make these decisions, and that's where our training in argument over this past term comes into play. In thinking about how we reason and make arguments with ethical considerations, we contrast it both with factual considerations and with other values that come into play. Recall that you spent the last exercise and reading in this class thinking about your own values and what justification you can provide for them. Some of those may have been ethical, or they may not have been ethical. We'll talk a little bit further about that today. We're going to be analyzing moral arguments by the type of imperative involved. You'll get some practice with that today, and that will set you up for completing exercise set number 10. Now, part of that is the Revel exercises, that is the quizzes that have been made available to you in Revel for Chapter 16. And then there's an exercise for you to hand in to your GA on analyzing ethical claims. What we focus on today has to do with understanding what ethical considerations are relevant. This helps us to prioritize our concerns, thinking about which particular ethical concerns are involved. Are we concerned with effects or duties? Are we concerned with personal welfare or the welfare of other people? These are priorities we need to set. But in order to do that, we have to know which moral values may be involved. That then can lead us to being able to think about alternatives, create different sorts of practical considerations to help us address the ethical considerations that we've recognized as priorities. Then we can negotiate the environment and figure out what our options are. But the first thing we have to do is to sort out that stage of prioritization, sorting out the values, sorting out what's important. In doing this, we take into account both values and facts. But these are different things. We associate facts with descriptions. We say, the class is nearly over. That's a fact. We say, I've enjoyed that class. That's also a fact, even though it's a fact about your emotions. But if we say that class is an important class, or you should take that class, then you are expressing a value with regard to the class. And a value is the basis for a prescription, saying that it's a good thing to do for you or for someone else. A prescription, just like you get a prescription at the pharmacy where a doctor says you should take this, but this is a prescription about what you should do, about practical matters. This raises the question whether values can be assessed the same way that facts are. And indeed, it turns out that they can. There are both moral and non-moral arguments. Ethical reasoning involves ethical claims. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It leads to recommendations, and sometimes it builds on recommendations that use words like should and ought. These are the prescriptive words that mark a value being involved. When you say that you should do something, you're saying that action would be valuable. That doesn't necessarily have to be a moral value. It could be another kind of value. We'll get into that in a second. But should and ought mark claims as being about values. There are other sorts of words that have a more descriptive content, but still convey moral attitudes. This is when we use adjectives like cruel or unfair, or when we say that is a truly fair thing to do, then we are also making a value judgment. Value judgments aren't just negative. They can be positive too. We can praise people for being just and fair. We can advise people to do things that would be just and fair. For example, consider this passage. The Supreme Court's decision to strike down Canada's prostitution laws ought to be resisted by the federal government with all means at its disposal. It is the upholding of Canadian values, not the protection of those who engage in immoral activities, that should be of primary concern. Now you see highlighted in red here at the beginning and end of the passage, ought and should. These express a generic moral imperative about how people ought to behave, about what the moral thing to do is. But the discussion of values and morality, saying that certain activities are immoral, show how more particular moral considerations are being used to support this argument. We will be learning to analyze moral reasoning. We won't be evaluating it. We'll just be looking at the structure of it. If we were to go forward and think about this some more, as we do in philosophy classes that study morality and ethics, then we would begin to think about evaluating moral claims. All we want to do for this week is to get you sensitive to how moral reasoning operates as a form of reasoning and how it relates to other forms of reasoning. A question we have to consider is whether we can move from what is the case, a factual or descriptive consideration, to what ought to be the case, a prescriptive or moral or ethical consideration. Now you may note that I'm treating what is moral as the same thing as what is ethical, and that is typically the case, that these words are used interchangeably. Whatever word we use to describe them, ethics or morality, these things are related to facts, but slightly different techniques have to be used for analyzing this form of reasoning. In practice, of course, we want to give reasons for our moral views, but they're different kinds of reasons than we give for factual views or to support certain sorts of descriptions. We can express evaluative judgments factually. We can say things like, if it is the case that someone is ignoring his obligations, then he is acting unfairly. We can say it is the case that someone is acting unfairly. We can say it is the case that someone is ignoring their obligations. We can make factual claims about it. There are moral facts, but they are a special type of fact, if you like, and perhaps more controversial and harder to maintain, harder to establish with any certainty. When we derive ought conclusions, prescriptions, claims about values, including claims about moral and ethical values, from is premises, descriptions, factual claims, we are not going to be reasoning deductively. We are always going to be saying something more than what's contained in the premises, saying quite a bit more, and we're only going to be able to say it with a certain amount of probability. It will remain the case that the conclusion could be false while the premises are still true. Evaluative conclusions, including moral and ethical conclusions, always retain some level of controversy. The strongest moral reasoning will be based on principles. Principles are general rules or recommendations that have wide applicability to cases, to particular circumstances, to particular states of affairs or situations that we find ourselves in. For example, there are moral principles, and this is our focus right now. We might say it is wrong to inflict unnecessary pain on other creatures. We're talking about a moral sense of wrongness, not right or wrong in a factual sense. We're not saying it's not true that pain is inflicted on other creatures. We're saying it ought not to be the case. It's not valuable morally. But that is a general rule. It's not just about a specific case. We're talking about pain in general and other creatures in general. So this can be taken to be a moral principle. Another example is, we should treat people fairly. You see here the word should. That's one of those evaluative prescriptive terms that characterizes values and ethics or morality in particular. And this statement describes a principle regarding people in general, both as actors, we is aimed at people in general, and also people as objects of treatment, how we should treat people in general, and that we should treat them fairly. Now, there are other principles that apply to other sorts of values besides moral or ethical principles. We have learned in our class some of these sorts of principles. We've talked about the value of telling the truth at the very beginning of this class. This was an important value for many of you. We've also talked about applying the rules of geometry. So we haven't talked about this, but we could tell someone who wanted to fit furniture into a room that they should apply the rules of geometry and that will help them do it. This is also prescriptive. It's telling people how they ought to behave, but it's not moral or ethical. A further example is, you should consider a deductive argument with true premises to have a true conclusion. This is a logical principle about deductive argument, something we have studied in this class. What distinguishes ethics and morality from other sorts of values is that it characterizes people's actions with regard to other people. When we're talking about logical values, we're talking about the value of pieces of reasoning or claims that are made or arguments. We're talking about these sorts of things that we say, these sorts of bits of communication. But when we talk about ethics and morality, we are talking about things that directly affect other people. The things we do that may hurt or harm other people or reflect on how we value them. That includes how we treat ourselves. We should treat ourselves well. We should also treat other people well. These are ethical concerns. Behavioral ideals or moral principles associated with ethics guide people in determining right and wrong actions regarding people. We can identify in this general realm of ethics a range of ethical imperatives. These are intended to shape or guide behavior by expressing core values and beliefs about what is morally right or morally wrong. Ethical imperatives express behavioral ideals and moral principles by pointing out what we ought to do or ought to refrain from doing in regard to other people. Philosophers generally recognize three types of ethical imperative. The first one of these concerns consequences. When we're considering this sort of ethical imperative, the consequences, we ask ourselves, what will be the effects of my action? If I do this, who will it hurt and who will it help? This is a very practical consideration, but often we don't have complete information about who it's going to help or who it's going to hurt. We have to guess about the effects. Also, sometimes it appears that we won't be able to make decisions based just on consequential concerns. Sometimes we have to think about general rules, duties that we uphold as members of a culture or a religion, or simply rules that we've devised for ourselves, duties that we maintain. Duties are when we ask ourselves, what moral obligations apply here? What responsibilities do I have? Do I have an obligation to uphold the law? Do I have an obligation to care for my family? These are different sorts of duties we can have. Sometimes they're in conflict with each other, and we have to weigh them. But they are general rules that we often consider when making moral arguments. Thirdly, there's the ethical imperative of virtue. Now, moral or ethical virtues are taken to be characteristics of a person. A person is virtuous or has vices. When we're concerned about virtue, we ask ourselves, what sort of person do I want to be? Do I want to be a kind person, or do I want to be a person who takes care of herself? Sometimes these are competing things. Sometimes being generous may be to your own deficit. So we have to worry about which thing we're going to consider most important. These are questions of virtue. Virtues can also apply to a society. Right now, in our culture, we are asking ourselves, what kind of culture do we want to be? Are we a culture that hangs together? right? When we help each other, we create patterns and practices. We make habits. We create images of ourselves for other people and for ourselves that will hold ourselves to. If we choose to be selfish, if we hoard supplies, or if we don't obey social distancing, then we are creating a culture of selfishness and we are indulging in vices. So this can happen at the cultural and societal level too, as well as at the individual level. And we're seeing a lot of discussion of this in news outlets online and opinion pieces. When we consider moral consequences, we consider the rightness or wrongness of an action. And we judge that by thinking about the consequences for everyone affected by it. If I do this, what will follow from that? What chain of events will I put into play? These considerations allow us to choose among options and choose the one that will likely produce the greatest net benefit for the greatest number of people. So all people are treated equally, and we're concerned to maximize pleasure or happiness and minimize pain or unhappiness for as many people as possible. It can be difficult here to figure out how many people we're supposed to consider. Do we consider only people we know? Do we consider people in our social circle, in our town, in our country? Do we consider all people in the world? Do we consider people in the future? Right? When Greta Thunberg asks us to think about future generations with regard to global warming, she is asking us to consider the effects of our current behavior on people in the future. So that's an awful lot of responsibility. And so consequentialism can become really complicated and difficult to work with because it's very hard to know how to account for people who may not even yet exist. The judgment is of future consequences, and we don't reflect on the back. We're not learning from history. We're not making general rules based on our experience. We're only thinking about what one particular action is going to do with regard to its effects on people in the world, ourselves and others. So that is the form of ethical imperative that concerns itself with consequences, the first one. The second one, in some detail, is duties. When we think about duties as a moral imperative, we are thinking about more general rules, and we are ignoring consequences and instead looking at what motivates our sense of obligation and responsibility. When we say things like, I should always do this or that, tell the truth, not inflict pain on others, these are general imperatives. Now, we can think that we should tell the truth for the sake of knowledge, or we can also think that we should tell the truth for the sake of treating other people with respect. And when our reason is because it's about respect, if it's based on an underlying duty to treat people with respect, then it's a moral concern, because not inflicting pain on others is a general moral duty. Some of the imperatives that provide duties include that we should act in a way that the principle underlying our action could be universalized. That whatever rule it is you're following, you could wish for that to be a rule that everybody else would apply. This is how we justify being generous to other people when they are in need. We would hope that if we were in need, other people would be generous with us. Sometimes this is known as the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is also formulated with a certain amount of precision by 19th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who says, act in such a way so as to treat always others as ends in themselves, that is, as purposes in themselves, as valuable in themselves, and not merely treat them as a means to an end. Or as we might say in ordinary English, don't be a user. Don't just use them to get things you want. Recognize that they have value in themselves. This is the sort of duty imperative that is quite central to Western culture. But there are problems that arise from duties also. How do we handle conflicts of duties? Sometimes, for instance, we might have a conflict between the duty to not lie and the duty to not harm. We can recognize that telling the truth can be harmful to someone. So sometimes we talk about telling white lies when we're simply trying to avoid hurting someone's feelings. But we can't just claim that. We have to be able to reason about that too. And philosophers have dug into this quite a bit over the centuries. Some philosophers divide general duties into perfect duties and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are normally taken to be absolute prohibitions like do not murder. And generally they don't conflict with each other. Imperfect duties, however, normally are sort of relative and context sensitive, such as saying help others in need. What counts as need? Should you do that if you're also needy? These are all contextual matters that we have to consider with regard to imperfect duties. And because they're so sensitive to context, imperfect duties can also conflict with each other. Perfect duties are generally taken to override imperfect ones. Again, this is something you can learn more about if you study duties-based ethical theories in a philosophy class. The third type of ethical imperative that we're looking at today concerns virtues. These are habits of mind or character traits. And as I've indicated, that can include the character of a culture or a society, a nation, too. What kind of character does an ethical person or an ethical society have? A person with a certain developed character who wants to preserve that character will act according to that character. You be the person you want to be. If you want to be generous, you'll act generously. If you want to be kind, you'll act kindly. Same goes for fairness and so forth. And these are all moral aspects of character, which makes these moral virtues. By contrast, there may be other sorts of virtues we encourage in ourselves. I know when I was young, I thought I was a friendly person. I thought I was positively disposed to people, but I realized that I never really reached out to other people, that I was shy. And so because I wanted to be a friendly person, I decided I needed to overcome my shyness. And I started reaching out to people and started saying hello to strangers and trying to start conversations with them. By doing this, I developed the character of a friendly person. And I was really glad I did this. But that's not really a moral virtue. It's just a way I wanted to be. But we can do this with regard to moral things too. We can decide that we're going to be more generous, and we can try to practice generosity. And that can become a habit for us, and we can make ourselves generous people. And that is a moral virtue. This can also help our deliberation. When we're asking ourselves how to proceed, we can ask ourselves, in this circumstance, what would count as the actions of a person who valued fairness? Our interest in critical thinking and the activity of critical thinking involves an interest in virtues too. You'll recall from the very beginning of the class that critical thinking is not just a set of skills. It can also be the character of a person. Fairness is an important value in critical thinking. That is, giving a balanced judgment, for example. You can be fair in making a particular decision. But fairness is also a virtue. It can become a quality of your character. And you can help that become the case by exercising the skill of fairness. And so, critical thinking involves virtuous activity. You could say that we are exercising critical thinking muscles to keep ourselves as critical thinkers, develop ourselves as critical thinkers, as virtuous in that way. Now, it's not a moral virtue necessarily. It can help us with our moral reasoning, but critical thinking is valuable because it makes us understand the world better. That applies to moral actions, but it also applies to other sorts of reasoning that are covered in other parts of the textbook. I encourage you to have a look at those other parts of the textbook. You have purchased access to that whole book, and you have it for at least another 6 months. So please go ahead if you are interested in doing this. It might be a way to bide your time over the coming weeks of social distancing. Consider this example for some practice identifying what sorts of ethical imperatives people use in their arguments. I'll give you a couple of minutes to read through this, and then we'll discuss the question at the bottom. What is the main consideration that underlies the reasoning in this example? Is it consequences, duties, or virtues? The ethical argument takes place in this part. And if we look at what's being said, we can see that what's being discussed is a process where one action leads to certain effects. So we see here talk of what is the result, right? A cloned organism is not the result of fertilization. We also see that it possesses some potential for developing into a full human being, but that this capacity, that is, this potential effect, is very limited. And that's why they choose to use different language. So if you draw attention to the language used here in terms of the result and the capacity, that helps us see how this ethical argument relies on the discussion of consequences. Those are the ethical imperatives at work. Here's another example. This is a recent article in the New York Times by fact-check reporter Linda Chi. She begins her article with some quotes from U.S. President Donald Trump, who said, "You have suicides over things like this when you have terrible economies. You have death. Probably, and I mean definitely, would be in far greater numbers than the numbers that we're talking about with regard to the virus." And then there's a link that she provides. Another quote from President Trump, "You're going to lose more people by putting a country into a massive recession or depression," and then there's a link for that. Here, the reporter is featuring Trump's arguments. Now, I'm going to ask you again to tell me what sort of reasoning is being used to make this moral argument. To help you along the way, I'll tell you what the conclusion is. The conclusion that Trump is arguing for is that the U.S. should prioritize the economy over combating COVID-19. Now, I want you to look at those reasons and think about what sort of moral reasons are being provided. Are they consequential? Are they duties? Or are they character-based? I think you'll see pretty quickly that these are also consequential. He's talking about suicides as a consequence of terrible economies. And he's talking about the numbers of deaths that will result from one sort of decision or another sort of decision. He says, you're going to lose, so that's a prediction about the future and future consequences. So what he's appealing to here are moral consequences, the effects on people. Again, we're not evaluating these arguments, we're just analyzing them to see what sort of moral imperatives are being used in different types of arguments. Next, we'll look at what the reporter herself argues now that she set up this contrast with the president's view. I'll give you a minute to read this to yourself. Here's another example from Vox magazine online. Take a few seconds, to read these sentences. I've indicated for you how you should take the conclusion. It's not totally apparent from this passage, but if you were to look at it in the larger passage, I'm sure you could pick this out. The conclusion is people should practice physical distancing. Now, given that you know that that is the conclusion, what are the premises going on in this passage? Are the moral premises appealing to consequences, to duties, or to virtues? They're appealing here to duties. And you can tell this by the language used. In your homework example, I will let you know which sort of moral imperative is being used. And your job will be to tell me how you can see that in the passage. So for this particular passage, it would be important to recognize the language of rights is being used. Upholding rights is a type of duty. And so this passage is discussing how we weigh one set of rights versus another set of rights. And we see it directly here in the language of rights, which captures a duty, the duty to uphold rights. Here's another example, also from Vox, this article titled, "I'll Do What I Want." Take a minute to read it. Here the conclusion is people must change. They must change their behavior. Well, values and morality are always about behavior. The question here is why. So we look in the passage and we look for language that will give us a clue if we're having trouble sorting this out. And I'm going to tell you now that this is a passage that appeals to virtue. In particular, it appeals to the virtue we can develop in dealing with the coronavirus and how that might help us deal also with the problem of climate change. Now, it might be hard for you to recognize in this particular passage, and I have tried not to give you anything quite this hard, but the language of collectivism talks about viewing ourselves and treating our values not just in terms of our own interests, but in terms of the interests of society. And that is a type of virtue. It discusses here how people need to behave and what is going to serve them well in the future. And that is why we can interpret this as being about virtues. Now, you might be able to make a case for this being about duty also, collectivism as a duty, but I'm going to give you a specified interpretation in your homework assignment. And so your job would be, in this example, to view this as using premises based on virtue. Moving towards your homework, there's a few words of warning for you. Reading about ethical issues can actually be really stressful, and I expect that you are all already pretty stressed. Even if you're bored, boredom can be stressful. However, right now there's a lot of uncertainty, and it can help us deal with that if we know that that's normal. It's normal and healthy even to feel upset by this, to feel unsettled. I've also found some bits of reassuring coverage for you where you can see some room for hope in case you find that all you're getting is doomsday coverage. You can look at some of the more authoritative sources that provide us with some room for optimism about the coming weeks and months. The first two links have to do with the virus specifically. This third one has to do with the economy, and it's about the US specifically, but a lot of it will apply to related economies such as the Canadian economy. Finally, sometimes it's just good to look at fun things. So there's a link with an extended video of puppies playing. Find one of Kitten's playing if you want. Whatever floats your boat, whatever gets you through, do the things you need to do to take care of yourself, right? That is a moral imperative too. So coming up, if you haven't yet, you should look at the chapter 16 in Revel. It is due by Wednesday, April 1st, the questions on that, and they are worth 2% of exercise number 10. The 3% portion of exercise number 10 that you will email to your GA is due by Friday, April 3rd at 8 p.m. Now, that is the last day of classes. Don't get confused and think that you can hand it in on Saturday or any time later. You cannot. That is the last day of classes, Friday, April 3rd. I know we've had a bit of a mixed up schedule in the last week and a half because we had to rejig things. And we only had 2.5 weeks to make up with 3 weeks worth of work. So it's Friday, the last week of classes, 8 p.m., as it has been since we went online. Finally, this is the end of the course. I hope you learned some things here. I know it's been a really trying course in a lot of different ways. If you ever have any questions about philosophy and taking other philosophy courses, you are welcome to come see me. I'm not around in the fall, I'm on sabbatical, but I actually am still available for appointments. So next fall, the following years, I'm around. Feel free to drop by my office or make an appointment. I would be happy to chat with you about other options among philosophy courses. And for now, during this period of physically distancing ourselves from each other, please take care of yourself, please take care for others, and be as safe as you can be.